to see you all, and thanks again for joining. As you can see with this dramatic echo, I'm not in the optimal place to moderate, but luckily we don't have to, because we have a fantastic moderator in the form of Salih, who's agreed to step up and talk and feature Tonya's exceptional work, Fight or Flight, examining the electoral consequences of violence in Senegal. So Tonya, I'm really excited to hear about this. Just as a quick reminder too, if any of you guys would still like to be in touch with any of our finalists for the Commons Program Director position, let us know. It was insane with Abby's visit last week and all of the craziness around the snow, but she has indicated she'd still love to meet with students, including frankly you guys. So I'm happy to connect you, offline. You can have a chat. I would love to hear your impressions of her and our other two finalists who will be coming through in the weeks ahead. And just one other quick note, next week we do have a special Ostrom book club with Sheila Foster from Georgetown Law that a lot of us have contributed chapters to, including Brian, Bill, Eric Nordman, even Angie and I. So I think it's going to be a fun discussion as well. Awesome. Okay. Without further ado, then I think over to you, Sally.
Okay. Scott, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Tonya, who is also my classmate. Tonya is a fellow at the Ostrom Workshop and a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science. Her dissertation research examines how different tactics of state violence and intimidation impact voting behavior and electoral outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa. She engages with both qualitative and quantitative methods, particularly focused on elections in Senegal. And she has extensive fieldwork experience with advanced proficiency in French and Wolof languages. And her talk is entitled Fight or Flight, examining the electoral consequences of violence in Senegal. So, Tonya, if you could present your paper in about half hour, then we will have Q&A session. I already had prepared questions in case people are still thinking about them. So the floor is yours, Tonya.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sally. I look forward to hearing from you as well as others. So everybody can hear me, right? That's not an issue. Okay. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Haven't done this in a while, so let's see. Okay. All right, so this is really part of a larger dissertation project, obviously, as Sully explained, where I'm looking at different types of violence and the consequences of that for voters. And also, another component of this is kind of looking at how civic activism and sentiments of political efficacy can kind of mediate these emotional responses to violence. So this is just really kind of one chapter from the dissertation, and but with added information so that it's not completely out of context, hopefully. All right, so to start with the whole issue with election violence that's kind of motivated my research, we commonly think about elections as being this sort of cornerstone to democratic accountability, right? The expansion and the third wave of democratization, there was a heavy focus on the introduction of elections, hoping that it would help to hold leaders accountable for bad behavior. But unfortunately, this has come at a high price, as we've noticed, for many emerging democracies. Instead, the introduction of elections has been accompanied with a lot of illicit electoral tactics, not including but not limited to the use of violence and intimidation as a means of tilting the electoral playing field in the perpetrator's favor. This has been particularly problematic in elections in sub-Saharan Africa. There have been several studies that have just kind of examined patterns of this and noted that, some degree of violence is prevalent in over half of elections since the 1990s. And it was typically thought that, this would be the most problematic at founding elections. And as everybody got the hang of experience with elections, violence would lessen. So the incentives for its use would go away. But this hasn't happened in the African context specifically, and is also still problematic in many emerging democracies in other regions. And we've even seen outbreaks of violence in more established democratic settings in Western democracies as well. So to date, though, the research kind of has mostly focused on understanding the determinants of election violence. So what kinds of situations put countries and specific elections at greater risk of experiencing violence. But we don't really know much about what the consequences of it are, specifically in terms of how it may affect voters differently and kind of lead to these different outcomes. So in addition to that, there has been some work that has started to examine this, that has started to think, okay, well, violence is used with the intention of, trying to tilt the electoral playing field in your favor, but it doesn't really work out that way always, right? There are sometimes unintended consequences. So the fact that this doesn't always seem to work has, motivated at least some research to begin with this question of looking at, how violence actually impacts voting behavior and election outcomes. But the findings on this, and in addition, the theoretical motivation behind the relationships is somewhat mixed. So some find that it helps incumbents win and depresses turnout, while others find that it actually does mobilize voters to turn out and then ends up hurting incumbents at the polls. Now, my research is suggesting that there are kind of two main reasons for this disagreement. One is that electoral violence is oftentimes treated as this black box concept, right? Its mere presence or not is examined as an explanatory factor, rather than looking at how different types of violence may lead to different effects. So a lot of the research has assumed all violence affects all voters in the same way. And those that have looked at specific types of violence have tended to focus on high intensity violence, which is actually far less prevalent of an occurrence when you look at patterns of electoral violence, specifically across sub-Saharan Africa. So my research question is, how do citizens respond to various tactics of more low intensity electoral violence, and what electoral outcomes are generated by such responses from voters? So I'll start with just kind of like getting a basic understanding of what election violence is. In its most basic definitional form, election violence consists of coercive or violent acts that are carried out with the intention of affecting the process of elections or the results themselves. So this is typically thought to be a subset of political violence more broadly, that's distinguished by this particular idea of intent of influencing the outcome of the election. So this motive, but also it's distinguished by its timing and when it tends to take place, and the actors that are involved, both the perpetrators and the victims. Now, since this is typically conceptualized as a strategic tactic by elites meant to influence the outcome, political parties are most often considered to be the primary perpetrators and victims of violence. So, but incumbents are most often the perpetrators, what we know based on empirical research. Now, the problem with most, and again, this is speaking to how this gets a little conceptually muddy, a lot of the actors involved, and whether perpetrators or victims, and studies of election violence are typically clumping a bunch of actors together under these, these umbrellas of incumbent party or opposition party. But there are a lot of different actors involved. I mean, it's not just political parties, but there are leaders, citizens, sometimes, parties will organize these youth militia groups to carry out violence on election day. So there's just a lot of variation in that. And I kind of get back to this point when I discuss kind of like my theory of how I'm motivating my disaggregation of low intensity violence. Violence typically is more common before elections, since that has the greater chance of influencing the outcome when it takes place beforehand. Often in studies, though, particularly in cross-national work, that's forced to develop these measures based on very specific sets of rules. We see these temporal cutoffs happen at time periods around the election, often somewhere between 3 and 6 months before and after. This runs the risk, of missing either electorally motivated events that took place outside of that truncated time frame, or including other forms of violence that are unrelated to elections. And again, I get back to this point and kind of like motivating my particular focus on one case. The tactics used can also vary considerably in terms of their severity. So electoral violence is also typically kind of categorized by on these specific measures, lethal versus non-lethal use. So do deaths result from this, or were these just threats? A lot of measures look at the number of deaths, so they distinguish between low and high intensity violence, usually based on an arbitrary cutoff of either around 10 or 20 deaths. So below 10 would still be considered low intensity, and above, for example, would be high intensity. But again, there's considerable variation even within that. Now, some have looked at, again, targeted intimidation, so highly focused attacks versus generalized mass violence as another way of kind of disaggregating these things and distinguishing them. So that being said, the variation that has been considered quite a lot in the context of looking at the determinants of election violence. But, as I said, these, when incumbents use election violence in the pre-election phase, they are using it typically with these kind of intended consequences. And, up until recently, the literature has kind of assumed that these are the things that happened, right? So violent policing of demonstrations and mass arrest are meant to threaten voters into abstention or incumbent support. Opposition imprisonments, torture, candidate disqualifications, these things are meant to discourage electoral contestation. So all these meant to, affect either voters or opposition elites and, influence their choices on election day. Now, some have suggested, as I said, that this can sometimes lead to unintended consequences of electoral backlash. And so there has been some work that's recently found a pattern in this, finding that this actually mobilizes voters and decreases the incumbent's chance of re-election. So it's argued that that violence provokes sentiments of anger and frustration and undermines the incumbent's legitimacy. And this has typically been looked at in, specific case study kind of focuses of more high intensity forms of violence, pretty much exclusively. So cases like Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, like the standard kind of cases that we think of when we think about election violence. But this is coming with kind of an over representation of high intensity violence and it's actually the less prevalent problem. So some have recognized this and tried to look at, instances of violence across multiple elections. So there's been arguments proposed here, again, kind of getting at this idea of like emotions and emotional responses to violence, that fear of election violence provokes anxiety that encourages information seeking. So that encourages people to go look for more information and gain more political knowledge. And this has been suggested to increase electoral mobilization and opposition support. But again, there are mixed findings on this effect. Some have found that these sentiments of fear don't actually mobilize the electorate, and they don't actually encourage people to support the opposition, while some have found that that effect does happen. So again, it's mixed findings on this. So I'm arguing here that focusing specifically on low intensity violence and intimidation, that different types of these tactics may provoke different emotional responses from voters that can explain these divergent outcomes that we see. So I'm arguing here that thinking about low intensity violence, so not this generalized mass violence, some tactics of violence and intimidation carried out by incumbents may present a more salient concern to voters and may provoke a stronger emotional response from them. So I'm looking at salience to the voter or salience to the average citizen in terms of how much they are directly kind of affected as targets. So the main targets of violence are often assumed to be, of government violence are often assumed to be opposition supporters, sorry. But again, there are several actors involved in who can be like primary victim and who is primarily targeted. So sometimes elites may be the main target, sometimes citizens may suffer the brunt of the blow there. But it seems kind of, this is motivated by the sentiment that I have that it seems kind of unreasonable to, to think that, police opening fire on demonstrators is going to be perceived exactly the same way to the voter as a opposition candidate being put in prison. So more broadly in this dissertation project, I'm looking at 3 different primary targets. So I'm classifying acts of election violence, tactics of government violence based on who the main target is. So in the broader dissertation, I distinguish between attacks on electoral institutions themselves, and in a previous chapter get at some variation in that, but this chapter is specifically focused on the choice between targets as either opposition elites or citizens. So tactics targeting citizens can include violent policing of protests, both lethal and non-lethal means. So non-lethal being the use of tear gas and rubber bullets. It can involve mass imprisonments of opposition supporters during demonstrations, bans on demonstrations and opposition campaign rallies, just to name a few. Tactics targeting elites can include short and long-term arbitrary political imprisonments, sometimes even more extreme cases, at least allegations of the use of torture or some evidence of it, and attacks on opposition convoys. And when I go through the case of elections in Senegal, I'm going to kind of note some specific instances that fall into these, that I classify in these different categories. So I'm suggesting here that violent tactics that that target citizens directly compromise the safety of citizens and are perceived to be more blatant and illegitimate than those targeting opposition elites. This kind of motivated from a similar point of previous work looks at cases of high intensity violence, why there's a backlash effect there. In addition, a previous chapter of the dissertation, I actually look at existing measures of violence, and it shows that pretty consistently these cases of high intensity violence tend to produce backlash, though it's against the incumbent, though it depends on the measure used. While low intensity violence, the effect of that is pretty inconclusive, which again, I'm arguing is because we don't have an accurate breakdown of that and theoretically motivated hypotheses on how those different tactics can affect outcomes. But the point being, citizen-targeted violence can serve as a stronger focal point of antithetical government behavior, provoking these sentiments of anger and frustration that encourage things that have been found in the literature to be linked to these kinds of sentiments in response to violence, such as information seeking and vigilance, civic activism, and even political dissent. So elite targeted violence, on the other hand, I'm arguing has a more indirect impact on voters since it's meant to target electoral contestation and the participation of opposition parties and candidates at its very source. So it limits the coordination capacity of citizens. Oftentimes as well, these tactics are used in a way that undermines opposition candidates' credibility. So they'll be put in prison a lot of times under faulty charges of corruption and embezzlement. But either way, it has the potential to, undermine their viability as a candidate. Again, eliminating the chance of contestation at its source. So I also argue that this, since it's not so directly affecting citizens, should provoke less anger, more sentiments of kind of despondence and apathy towards the issue. So citizen-targeted violence, I'm suggesting, is more likely to lead to an incumbent loss, whereas elite-targeted intimidation is more likely to help incumbents win elections. So I'm also suggesting that this should have a mediating effect on turnout. So citizen-targeted violence may not provoke emotions of anger for all voters. So some people have, so there's been some work in the literature, just politics literature that looks at emotional responses to state repression, typically in the form of protest behavior, that have suggested that some people have just higher fear thresholds that they can't get over and are more prone to be risk averse. And this research suggests that individuals with high political efficacy and civic activism tend to be more risk accepted when confronted with violence. They tend to be more likely to experience sentiments of anger and frustration and engage in backlash against that. So greater, and in addition, greater civil society mobilization. So when, violence that targets citizens serves as this focal point and mobilizes civil society to a greater extent, we should see lower fear thresholds and more anger provoked. Now, again, this might not happen for everybody though. So like fear and despondence may be the dominant emotions for individuals who lack the same sentiment of political efficacy and past behaviors of civic activism. So among those with lower political efficacy, elite targeted violence in contrast shouldn't provoke quite as much fear, since again, it's not directly impacting the citizen. So therefore having a less of a depressing effect on turnout. So with this idea of civic activism and political efficacy kind of like mediating how people respond, I would expect that citizen targeted violence, even though it can generate a backlash, because it's not going to provoke that sentiment for everybody, it's more likely to engender fear among many and decrease turnout to a greater extent than elite targeted violence. So again, I'm comparing Senegalese elections here. I'm not going to get too much into the empirical stuff because it's, you know, super nitty gritty with a case specific focus. And hopefully everyone's had time to look at the paper at least a little bit. But I'm basically looking at 4 different presidential elections in Senegal, specifically because presidential elections are more high stakes and tend to be associated with more violence. And in the analysis, I also control for alternative explanations of poor economic performance, since poor economic performance tends to be one of the most consistent predictors of incumbent turnover. The benefits of using the single country focus is that I can more accurately distinguish electorally motivated violence from other forms of political violence to try and avoid that conflation without being constrained by temporal kind of cutoffs. So I can look at the entirety of the election cycle and all events that took place and find what is seemingly related to the election, what is not. It also affords me an opportunity to actually disaggregate these events by who they're primarily meant to target, since existing cross-national work and cross-national measures can't do this. And I can also control for certain macro level alternative explanations that would normally vary from country to country. So I use a variety of data of sources here. And like I said, this is a qualitative study. So I'm drawing on human rights reports from sources like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, State Department reports, international and local news sources. So some scholarly articles, some descriptive statistics from Afrobarometer, and it's not as much integrated in this version and the actual write-up, but I've also been looking at CSO websites and statements and social media platforms to look at kind of how people have responded to specific allegations of violence and specific events. Now, arguing that Senegal is a really important case to look at because it is largely peaceful outside of the electoral process. So again, helping to avoid conflation with other types of political violence. It's also far more common empirical representation of low intensity violence. Ethnicity, religion, and partisanship are actually able to be kind of somewhat comfortably rejected as alternative explanations in this context as well, since ethnicity has never been a salient form of a salient factor in voting behavior. It's predominantly Muslim country, so like religious affiliation has not typically been a super prominent issue for voters. And partisanship, a lot of party switching also happens. Opposition parties come in and out all the time. People tend, it's been shown in Senegal, not to be like super committed to one single party over time. It's also a case where there's been a lot of recent democratic erosion, which kind of speaks to the importance of looking at the consequences of some of these forms of low intensity violence. I'm not going to really go through the historical background of Senegal, but instead just kind of go through kind of the main things that I've found in terms of differences between citizen targeted violence and elite targeted violence. So most of the citizen targeted violence that took place or that has taken place is predominantly confined to the 2012 elections. I guess maybe I'll go to this summary of the results first. So I basically find with examining all of this data and developing this qualitative narrative that in 2007 and 2019, we mostly see opposition elites being targeted. And we also see this lower mobilization effect from civil society. So by consequence, we see somewhat higher turnout during these elections, particularly in 2007, 2019, and is a case where the incumbents reelected. So again, during these elections, this is where we see the opposition, the imprisonment of opposition leaders was a pretty common tactic across both of them. Particularly in the 2007 elections, there were attacks on two of the main opposition candidates, which they alleged were assassination attempts. And you know, these kinds of imprisonments can also bar candidates from running. So I'm arguing that these tactics were able in these elections to effectively eliminate the coordination capacity of the opposition, which helped these incumbents win re-election. Now, in contrast, we can discuss this in the Q&A, but 2000 is not like a perfect representation here, but certainly in 2012, most of the tactics of citizen targeted violence were focused on most of the tactics of violence were focused on citizens. So there were a lot of instances of both lethal policing, so firing guns at protesters, non-lethal forms, tear gas, rubber bullets. There were several events that occurred that resulted in numerous injuries, as well as quite a few deaths as well. There's still not a whole lot, and a lot of arrests of civil society activists and protesters in general. So again, was mostly focused on citizens, which again, we see a much lower turnout, likely because as Afrobarometer descriptive statistics indicate, there was stronger prevalence of emotions of fear following that election, but also a highly mobilized civil society. So I'll just blow through this. So basically, suggesting that 2000 and 2012 led to these dominant sentiments of fear that may have depressed turnout, but still led to incumbent turnover because civil society was highly mobilized and people were active and angry. And in 2007 and 2019, by contrast, we see elite targeted violence successfully keeping incumbents in power, but not necessarily depressing turnout. And this idea that finding that elite targeted violence tends to be a more successful tactic for incumbents, at least in the context of Senegalese elections, suggests it may be a particularly problematic form of violence that has often been overlooked. So I'm going to go ahead and, I guess, stop here. And we can discuss some of these limitations in the Q&A because I'm sure others have already noticed this of reading the paper, but.
Thank you very much, Tonya. So I would like to open the floor to Q&A. And Tim is here. Hi, Tim. Nice to see you. Okay, well, I can start off with the first
I
question.
think Tim raised his hand, Sally. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, please, Tim, please go ahead.
Okay.
Scott.
Yeah, thanks. Good to see everybody. I had thanks, Tonya. I was focused. I was thinking mainly about the motivation. This is an important topic. I just kind of as a suggestion to kind of draw us into the project. I guess I wanted a little more clarity on two things, right? So what does a change in, you know, start from the question of how does violence affect, you know, behavior, or how does it affect incentives, and who are the actors, right? And so what are the intentions? I just feel like if you started out with some sort of fundamental building blocks, rather than saying, well, some people think this, some people say that, and set things up and say, and then tell us more clearly about whether you do get into sort of target, which is good, which I see as one dimension. You know, target means that, you know, why would an elite have an incentive to target the opposition versus target somebody else, right? But then I think the intensity part is what I see as kind of your other dimension. I wrote on a piece of paper kind of a, you know, 2 dimensions, which I think if you could show a picture of that, you know, I always like pictures, but of sort of unpacking this, right? This amorphous black box called violence. And then I thought to myself, well, how does high intensity affect the calculus of a politician, right? Incentives, and how does it affect the calculus of a citizen, right? So that's just my sort of preference for kind of setting this up. Other people might have other preferences too, but I think you got a little bit sort of bogged down in what we don't know in the literature, which is great. You should say that, right? But then you want to come out and say kind of more assertively how, like, oh, if we go back and actually think about how these things affect, you know, emotions and rational actions, or whatever you want to say more foundationally, then that really draws us in, I think, more. So that was the only thing that's the only thing I had to say in terms of setting it up. But I think, and then I guess second point, and I'll be quiet, but I think it might help. So you set up your case studies saying that, you know, I draw on lots of different resources, and that's great. You've got lots of different, you know, all the sources, you know, but I think it'd be better about, all right, what are the elements of, what am I going to walk you through in these 4 or 5 elections, right? And then it would be almost like, maybe you do this in the paper, but have sort of a table or a summary where you can say, oh, here, this election, here's my evaluation of how things happen in that election on these 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different criteria, right? And then you would, whenever you're doing comparative case analyses like this, which is basically what you're doing, you really need to help sort of anchor things for us so we can understand the basis of comparison. And that's hard to convey sometimes in a 30-minute talk, but I think just having that structure will give more, will be more convincing in terms of whatever you find. So anyway, great paper, and thanks for presenting it.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, especially with your last comment, I totally agree, and I just was kind of struggling with like the restructuring of like kind of the empirical narrative, because I definitely agree that the way it's broken down is not as helpful and like reflective as maybe going breaking it down in terms of, oh, like instances of incumbent re-election. How do we explain that? Here are these 2 elections and all the similarities they share, and how this affected the outcome. So that's my intention moving forward, is to restructure that. I just kind of like ran a little bit out of time with working so much on the front and trying to make the theory a little bit better. But yeah, no, I completely agree.
Thank you very much, Tim. Anyone else who has questions? Let me see if there is any hand. Okay. Yeah, Jamie, please go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So Tonya, it's always really cool to read about your work, just because you're thinking about so many things, and like you're not trying to distill this to a simple problem and simple answer. And I think that's so valuable in research. It's awesome. Thank you. Something that I noticed, and that may be like incidental to what you're doing, but you mentioned the incentivization of a multi-party system, and how introducing that into the study changes the way violence is sort of employed or operationalized. Could you describe what those incentives are a little bit? I may have missed those when I read your paper. But I think that might be really fascinating, because we know, and here's why, because we know that not all multi-party systems lead to violence. So that would be a really interesting, I think, something to tease out as well. Anyways, what are some of the incentives that you've been seeing caused by the introduction of the multi-party system?
Yeah, so I mean, it's I think this kind of gets at the whole, I mean, the whole idea about you know, looking at kind of like what the modern dictate, like the modern competitive authoritarian, to use like political science jargon, is kind of like thinking about, is kind of an interesting point people are starting to or revisiting again now, especially when we're seeing a little bit more backsliding. But the whole like kind of puzzle with, you know, with violence and, you know, state repression more broadly, and you know, these kind of you know, attempts at manipulating the process in some way, even if you're not outright stealing it, like kind of comes from the uncertainty that's introduced when you start bringing multiple parties in that can contest an election. So so typically we see in the past with these expansions to multi-party competition where other parties are allowed to compete, now there's an element of uncertainty that's been introduced for incumbents. And so then they may resort to some of these other tactics, which, you know, there are multiple tactics that a, you know, dictator can use. I say that word dictator pretty accusingly, but you know, there's multiple tactics in the toolkit, with violence kind of being one of those tactics. You know, the puzzle, I think, as well, is that it's kind of persisted all this time. Like, we would have thought there's some democratic learning that would happen, but there's still this incentive to use it to kind of tilt the playing field in your favor, you know, whether that's by intimidating opposition candidates to keep them from even contesting an election in the first place, or possibly boycotting the election to where there's essentially very little competition, or you know, whether that involves you know, harassing journalists and voters. And but yeah, again, I think that kind of speaks to Tim's point too, is like, what are the different intents and what are the different motives that I think I could spend more time kind of thinking about more critically and clearly outlining, because I mean, yeah, part of my argument here is that like these different tactics will, like, there's the intent of and the incentive to change, to alter the outcome, but like there are specific incentives even within that basic objective that could look very different depending on what tactic is used.
Okay, thank you very much. Brian?
Thank you. So well done paper. Apologies, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about, or at least point out, the elephant in the room. So what are the implications for, you know, the implication for the ruler seems pretty clear. You know, they should personally target the opposition. So the next round, what are implications for politicians and parties who are trying to think about how to respond to violence? And this is not just Senegal. I mean, in the US, we've had a number of the people targeted by Trump who've reported threats to themselves and their family, and that is a concern affecting their decision making. And then in the news the last few days, we have the Republican National Committee characterizing post-election violence as legitimate political discourse. So if you want to just talk about Senegal, okay, but I think there are much bigger implications. I could say some other things, but thanks.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I don't really know like what's the I guess I don't really have any insight at the moment or at this point in thinking about it as to you know what like how to you know combat this kind of perverse trends, because yeah, the implication that you know actually targeting elites instead of citizens could be a more effective means at winning elections and consolidating power. That's pretty problematic. So I think that there is some I think that there's some variation, or there's some way to think about, like you said, like how the opposition is responding to this, or what like responses are available. And I only just kind of started thinking about how those opposition responses could look different. Kind of looking at specifically looking at Senegal. The 2019 election is a like slightly tricky one because, you know, I'm saying it was kind of more dominated by these tactics of elite intimidation. But there was, I mean, there were some deaths that result, like citizens were targeted and like some isolated instances of it. But then the opposition also responded to that by, you know, actually not explicitly calling for violence, but using a lot of language that called for violence, and some encouraging people to boycott the election. And I think that there's some variation in how opposition leaders could respond to this that might either enhance their credibility and give them the tools to actually, you know, push back against this kind of electoral repression, versus you know, undermining their credibility and you know, making it a more successful tactic for incumbent politicians. But yeah, I appreciate that point, because it is something I've, you know, since kind of thinking about this, I've just started to think a little bit more about. Yeah, and it's a problematic implication. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Ryan?
if I can just
Yes,
push a little bit, but you can decline. You know, we're facing democratic erosion, challenges to democratic norms in the US. I mean, do you have any comments? I think these are at least things all of us should be concerned about, and hopefully they're better answers than just having the, you know, everybody, you know, get ready for a civil war. And more broadly, also where some analysis might make the difference is how in many countries the opposition party end up kind of stuck with boycotting elections in a very kind of counterproductive way, that it sends a signal and attacks legitimacy, but is pretty self-defeating. So again, any comments on the US? And otherwise, yeah, important line of work to pursue. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, that's part of what I don't think I necessarily spent enough time on in the paper, but like definitely one of like the motivations for kind of trying to look at some of these like problematic forms of low intensity violence is that we are seeing increasing democratic erosion, like not just in, you know, some of these, you know, what they'd say like established contexts for, Senegal is typically thought as like an more established democratic context compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. But, it has been kind of slowly backsliding in the past decade. And we're starting to see, similar trends like in, even more established contexts that we thought were pretty immune to this because we have consolidated democracies. But, I think a clear lesson that's becoming apparent is that nobody is immune from the potential for violence and intimidation to dominate elections. Nobody is immune from democratic backsliding. I don't really, I just don't, I don't really know what the kind of pushing forward what the best course of action necessarily be. I think that's gonna require a lot more thought moving forward.
Thank you. Scott, your background changed. So I assume you are no longer in the car shop, repair shop.
I know. Yeah, based on the revised estimates, we pulled the plug. But it's still on life support. It might be okay. It might be okay. Sorry about the pup. Yeah. Hey, Tonya, really nice paper as well. Just kind of echoing what's been said. I just had two quick thoughts from the chaos of the repair shop to the chaos of home. One is if you're interested, we're at the early stages of putting together this new edited volume on democratic resilience around the world. We just put the proposal into, this is for you as well, Sally, to Cambridge Press last month. So far it's Michael McRobbie and I kind of leading that, but I think we're going to be looping in others. And it's both broadly around electoral interference, election infrastructure, as well as misinformation. So I think some of this work could fit in pretty well. So I'm happy to chat with you, Sally, others who are interested, to see if you guys might be keen on that project. And to that latter point of the misinformation, I think we talked about this earlier, Tonya, but the digital repression piece. I mean, the real world violence that you did such a good job of documenting here is one avenue, one mechanism to further the ends of these repressive regimes. But as Jess and others kind of test, there's a lot of other tools at their disposal. So I'm wondering if you have in the back of your mind at some point, like doing a comparison, right, about actual physical electoral violence, in Senegal, perhaps compared to some of the other digital repression that we're seeing, elsewhere in Africa, and how those different trends are playing out and undermining, as Brian was saying, democratic resilience across Africa, right? And if one or the other is, they're both troubling in different ways to different groups, and the stakes can be different, though, they can also be similar, as we've seen with, different ethnic minorities being targeted on social media and otherwise. So anyway, I'm curious if you've thought about those aspects more as you've done further into this, and happy to chat more about the end of the volume project too, if you're interested.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested to hear more about that project for sure. I haven't thought so much about the role of digital repression, which although I have been very interested in the implications of misinformation and its how detrimental it can be for for democracies. One thing, as we've talked about, there are a lot of things from the authoritarian toolkit, and nowadays with the role of social media and the expansion of digital platforms for disseminating information and targeting, that's a whole nother ball game that's been opened up. One thing that I am doing in the paper, or in the broader dissertation, is kind of considering this choice between tactics within the context of the attacks on the electoral institutions themselves, or changes to electoral codes themselves, because there's been kind of an expansion of some of this work that's basically arguing the modern day dictator is not going to commit like blatant election fraud. Most likely they're competitive authoritarians, right? So they're trying to maintain like some sense of democratic legitimacy. So sometimes they'll actually, which there's a lot of variation in the kinds of changes that they make, but they'll make changes to, institutions themselves, to use democratic means for undemocratic ends, basically to tilt the electoral playing field by using these legal means to do it. And there's a lot of variation in how blatant or subtle these tactics end up being perceived, as a detriment to democracy. Sometimes they're sold as a pitch of helping democracy. So I have a chapter that I'm working on that's kind of trying to like unpack that context and, look at how that kind of like conditions these different choices that are made when choosing targets of actual violence, intimidation. So.
Thank you.
Sorry, super cool. Thanks a lot.
Oh, do you want to add something, Scott?
Oh no, you're okay. I didn't want to call out Jessica because I knew she had to leave, but her chapter and the edited volume we'll be talking about in a few months with Cyan and Frederica and others is a really nice overview. I think of how various types of repression they put together kind of a framework, digital and non-digital likewise. So that could be a useful just kind of guide if you're thinking about the intersections of some of that stuff. So anyway, it might be worth following up. I'm happy to put you guys in touch too.
Yeah, I got a message from privately from Jess in the chat, basically like saying, reach out to me if you want to talk more. So definitely going to do that.
Okay, Jamie. So we have 2 minutes until it's 1 o'clock, but Tonya, do you have time to keep going for more questions or do you want to call it at 1?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to stay on, I certainly have a few more minutes. Just
sure.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah,
I'll keep
Jamie?
my question brief too. Just you mentioned in the context, I think of answering my question, you mentioned this idea of like, we thought that democracy would have been learned or some reference to that, like the learning of democracy that didn't happen. And I'm curious, like, is this that sounds like an assumption that scholarship has been making. And that might be something you want to address in your paper, right? Because that's something that the Ostroms talked about, that we have to examine our assumptions. And this assumption that a dictator is going to adopt democratic principles, out of the goodness of their heart, might be a faulty assumption. And if that's the case, your paper would be a perfect opportunity to address that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And I think that's part of, I think that's a lot of the motivation for kind of wanting to take a more critical eye at some of these tactics and these things that are being used to undermine elections still, because it was largely assumed in early scholarship that looked at the effects of introducing elections, saying elections reduce repression, elections engender accountability. But then as time progressed, we saw that wasn't happening. And so like now, or that even if that did happen, like we're now seeing, as, Brian's pointed out, we're seeing backsliding across a lot of contexts that we thought that incentive was gone, and it's actually not. So yeah, I mean, you're right. It makes it a very, very salient concern right now. And yeah. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. So, Tonya, I will just make a recommendation. I've been thinking about triangulating your evidence. So you do provide some macro dynamics, but I was thinking whether it would be possible for you to use Afrobarometer data or other data sources, or even voter turnout, to collect data on violence, street level violence, for instance, I don't know, from internet, from website, and try to see whether it relates to decreases in turnout within the country. Another point would be, to look at Afrobarometer data again to identify the location of respondents to the lowest level possible. And then to see whether, where violence occurs has any ramifications for what happens in terms of their political preferences. So I think you can go both ways. First, you can look at actual turnout data at the lowest district level and to see, to collect news about riots or, electoral violence against protesters, violence against party workers, to see there's any relationship. And second would be to look at Afrobarometer data, to locate the lowest level possible in terms of the location of respondents, and to see, if the levels of trust or, the engagement or whatever you operationalize varies based on that. So I think these two would be my ideas for moving forward. I think you have an interesting overall question, but I think you need to get into more micro dynamics to make your argument more solid.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sully. I totally completely agree. I'm unfortunately bound by certain data limitations, though, and the availability of decent representation of some of these concepts and existing micro level data, particularly with the Afrobarometer. So I guess I'll start first with actually that's I really like your point about maybe getting some district level kind of, and I have some district level electoral data. There are some things I've had to reach out to the Electoral Commission's office for, which if you're not actually in Senegal, they don't really want to get back to you and feel no motivation to do it in a very timely manner at all. So that's been difficult to get some of that, but I do think that that could be an important thing to bring in, to be look, this is kind of some variation across districts, and we're seeing here's where violence happened, and here's the specifically, and here's the effect we see. So I really like that point. And I think that could, again, yes, add to the richness of the narrative.
Yeah. So you have you will have two empirical sections, one looking at, a specific election year, for instance, and you say, okay, this was a dynamic at that time. And, in another section, you kind of engage in your current discussion in terms of what happens, when different forms of violence occur. So I think if you put those two side by side, your reviewers, looking at from a reviewer's perspective, the paper will be more appealing.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. I think that would be, yeah, it would, that would really help to bring in. I do want to say something about the Afrobarometer data, just because I'm interested to hear your thoughts in light of the limitations. But so one of the things that I would ideally have really liked to do if Afrobarometer asked anything about this was, to better get at, like you said, these micro dynamics and how people are responding to violence. So the problem is that it doesn't really get at emotions in response to violence. None of these questions really do. And even the stuff, even if I'm going to infer something about the kinds of, emotions that stem from, or reactions that stem from people with higher political efficacy and everything, I guess the quality of those questions that relate to that vary a lot from round to round, with most rounds kind of not doing a great job of actually capturing that.
No, I think none of your hypotheses focus on emotions. You know, like emotions could be a mechanism that you propose.
Yeah, I
And,
think
you
that's
know,
what it's the mechanism.
you can find the secondary evidence for it, you know, I think easily. But but for your hypothesis, I think, especially focus on turnout and chance of re-election, you can just, you know, go in Senegal, go to the lowest level possible in terms of election results. And again, lowest level possible for where and when violence occurs. You know, just check out an archive research of major newspaper, I don't know, local newspapers, major newspapers, or next time you go to Senegal, just go to the office of local newspapers in each district if you can. And, you know, just collect these two sets of data and look at these main dynamics in terms of citizen turnout. So that, and for elite turnout, for elite intimidation, I guess, you know, you could, for elite intimidation, you could get away with interviewing you could possibly get away with, you know, it could be enough interviewing a few elite politicians, you know, about what happened afterwards, so and so. But I think that it's durable, you know, if you have the time and the resources to collect data on elections and the occurrence of violence across Senegal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've got, I've definitely got in what I've collected so far, like, you know, notes about, you know, specifically not just what occurred, but where it occurred. So I think you're right in like getting some more, you know, finite, subnational kind of level data, and like seeing how that corresponds with where it happens would be helpful. I do really like your point about reaching out to or maybe going to like offices of local newspapers. That's a really good idea.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I think if you can collect enough data, you can at least show sometimes, explain some types of difference, whether time-wise or, you know, location-wise. And, you know, when you're on the field, you can also discuss with civil society, you know, and, you know, fill the blanks when, if there's missing data, or, you know, if some mechanisms are unclear. So I think if you need, maybe you need a month of additional fieldwork, I don't know. But I think this paper is promising, quite promising, if you can get the right data in it. You know, it can go to very good comparative politics journals, but I think you need to go beyond what you have right now to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you 100% on that. I mean, one thing I'd really like to do, one thing I'd really like to be able to show much better, but in the absence of, you know, field work and, you know, what I'd really like to do is if I had like all the, you know, ability to go to the field and all the resources. One thing that I think would be really helpful for something like this, getting at these kind of micro level dynamics and how people are responding to violence, would be to do like to do some sort of like experimental setting with like proposing different, even just something as basic as proposing different vignettes to like of, oh, so this opposition elite candidate was targeted with this type of violence and this happened, like, you know.
So do you know,
how do you feel about that?
Yeah.
Or I don't know.
do you know GLD, University of Gothenburg in Sweden? So they have a GLD local governance project. Okay, so if you need funding, if you want to run experiment, for instance, you need funding. They have a competition. I think it ends around October each year. So just email them. You know, if you tie it to some sort of local context, you know, you can get funding to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right now I am sitting on some decent funds, just you know, not enough to do everything, I guess.
Okay. And
yeah.
I will say another thing. At the end, you say these findings are not generalizable beyond the Senegal. Is this because you're Lauren McLean's student? You wrote that. I was just curious if this is an inspiration you got from Lauren McLean.
Well, I mean, I should I should rephrase to not be so self-deprecating, but I mean, I guess the better way to say it is like, you know, I can't generalize necessarily beyond the case, but you know, the findings have implications for other similar contexts or whatever.
I feel like this is something Lauren McLean will tell her students to say, you know, but I was just imagining it, so I don't know.
I think one time I did a paper and I said something like that was a little bit overzealous about, like, you know, the findings, like I don't know, like I can't remember my wording, but something about like it's, you know, provides evidence that blah 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 in general affects whatever. And she's like, no, you can't generalize to other cases. And then it was just like, so really kind of like nailed that home to me. So, but I think you're right. I don't necessarily need to use that language, right? I could just say like it has implications for other similar settings and instances of low intensity violence.
So I would also so it would be hard, especially hypothesis 2, for you to compare elite violence versus elite-based violence versus what was the second? So your second hypothesis comparing two things, right?
Yeah, I feel like my second hypothesis is a little like muddy.
Citizen targeted versus elite targeted. So if you go to subnational level, it will be hard to test that hypothesis because, you know, an argument will always come up, you know, in this province, yes, there was violence against elites, but, you know, this province has many different dynamics than the other province. So I would work on reformulating, you know, rather than comparing elite-based to citizen-targeted, you know, if you want to go down to that route, well, you know, you might consider it better to reformulate that hypothesis to think differently. Just that out. You don't need to follow through it.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess, like I said, I feel like the second hypothesis is like, it feels wonky to me right now, and I'm still trying to figure out, I guess, with like the argument leading up to it and how like I phrase it of like the best way. Because I'm basically making an argument that, like, you know, political efficacy and civic activism is like this mediator that kind of like explains why some people may get angry about citizen targeted violence, but others may just get like afraid and feel hopeless and stay away from the polls. But then like, you know, I've kind of struggled with like how to frame that, because right now it's like framed as like elite targeted versus voter targeted being the difference, with the suggested like mechanism of, you know, civic activism, but not actually like in the hypothesis itself. So I think I need like some
also for hypothesis 1A and 1B, I think you put them back to back. But I felt a bit overwhelmed when I read them back to back. So I had to go back to the previous paragraphs because they are different hypotheses. So I think it would be helpful to separate them out with their own motivations. Okay. And final comment is, well, two final comments. In your presentation, you have three main bullet points supplied by sub points. I think if you're going to, especially if you're going to use sub bullet points, points below points, basically, if you leave at 2, it will be more helpful for us to follow, especially, because we are presenting by distance. It can be a bit challenging to follow what you are. I made the same mistake in my presentation. I basically filled up the screen, and it was later on someone told me that it was overwhelming. So I think this is something to consider in terms of making it more manageable to follow. I think increasing the slide size, but shrinking down the number of bullet points you have, and some of the sentences that you have in each slide would be helpful. And also, when you motivate your case, Senegal, I think it comes much later in the paper, but your motivation could come first. And in your presentation, you can just mention it very early, I think, without getting into too much detail. But thank you. It's been 80 minutes. I'm sure you are exhausted. But
a couple more comments if you have a minute or two.
Yeah, Brian.
Okay, yeah, so part of it just on the personal side, I lived and worked in Thailand. So that's part of my reference in a country that seemed to have made a democratic transition, had a peaceful electoral transfer of power between parties and more than once, and then is totally backslid, but is still going the route, like you talked about, of manipulating the rules much more than overt violence. So locking up people for speech, lèse-majesté, depends on where you want to categorize that. So to the extent in the future you look comparatively at places like Thailand and Cambodia, maybe also Bangladesh, that I think these kind of concepts and analytical issues would be quite interesting. And in terms of the chapter you talked about, I guess to check or curious, it sounds like you are looking at this question of, okay, for the incumbent, they can make a choice of, do we use violence or do we, rig the system and, try and disqualify potential candidates, including, show trials and what have you. And this gets to the motivation question, to step behind that, to say the other part is, okay, at what point do you have situations where the incumbents say, okay, I'm not going to use violence, I'm not going to rig the system, and I'm going to risk losing, and the classic democratic argument is because, okay, I have a reasonable chance of getting in office again, and that's better than hanging on for and doing things on principle that are unprincipled and may have consequences. So to the extent that you address that kind of larger framework, that seems very important in terms of both establishment of democracy and, unfortunately, like you're talking about how it can unwind and erode, and Hungary and the US and these other places where you have people who decided they're not going to play by the old rules. So.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I kind of was hinting at earlier in like a previous chapter, like I do look at like kind of these changes to like the electoral code. And I mean, there's a lot of variation in how they'll use that, but like the basic motivation, is coming from this idea that like, a lot of these leaders are existing in a world where blatant violence sometimes it's not, like, that's not the first choice. Like, if you're uncertain about whether you're going to get reelected or not, then the first choice may be to, make some subtle changes to tilt things in your favor. So I'm kind of like, I think like my theory map and like kind of the way I'm thinking about it, I still need to like spend probably even more time thinking about and working through. But like right now, I kind of have almost like a sequential argument of like arguing like they're not going to start with blatant violence. Like that's the choice of using that tactic is like made in a context where there are different challenges placed against the incumbent, different degrees of uncertainty, but like they're probably going to start with more subtle forms of trying to tilt things in their favor. So that's like kind of what I try to demonstrate in a previous chapter, which but
Okay,
yeah.
in terms of the logic of their decisions. So I
Mhm.
guess, and I'm not a political scientist, so you probably know much more relevant theories, but one of them I think is what gets talked about of, elite bargains and, some
Mhm,
acceptance
mhm,
of, okay,
mhm,
we're going to have an opposition, Whig Tories,
mhm,
or Labor, Christian Democrat, whatever, and
mhm,
okay, we'll let them win some elections. And that may be an elite who think, actually, we're going to, in general, keep power more and, okay,
mhm,
let people vent some steam and let somebody take the blame. And then next time we can come
mhm,
back in. That's one interpretation of how multi-party systems with democratic transitions can
mhm.
work, and
Yeah.
how that works or how it breaks down. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of interesting with Senegal because every opposition candidate and party, almost it seems, every one that's ever been viable was kind of like born out of the incumbent government and like the dominant party. But like it's, the opposition in Senegal is like historically resulted from like breaks in the ruling party, where they're not co-opted anymore. And then uh, that's, that's like the source of like actual contestation. So like I was reading something recently that actually like showed like every president of Senegal, like every point of secession was actually like not some opposition outsider necessarily coming in and uh, you know mobilizing voters and winning the election. It was like it's always been somebody that was like super close to the president in a previous administration, that just broke away from the party and then started their own. Um, which is kind of interesting. And now, and thinking about it, I'm like, I wonder how like unique Senegal really is, just kind of as a case with
Can
how elites
Well,
are
that's where,
behaving compared to other contexts.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think other possibilities, and again, this is probably beyond your dissertation
mhm,
project. I mean, but the kind of last election in Thailand, you actually did
mhm,
have opposition who was somebody who kind of had, made his money in business, had not been political before that election. And
mhm,
he actually attracted a lot of support, surprising
mhm,
amount of support, enough to maybe scare the elite. And so they've
mhm,
gone and, hammered
mhm,
him down. But it is an example of somebody coming from another pathway into
mhm,
it. Whereas, yeah, in Bangladesh, you've got these, kind of rival family
mhm.
histories and dynasties. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's actually like interesting, in Senegal, like, the kind of like politics as usual might be changing a bit because that's similar to the story like mentioned in Thailand. Like, there's one opposition leader in particular that's like was like a poet or something, like came
oh,
from
oh,
like completely outside of like the political mainstream. Um,
okay.
and even contested the last presidential election, came in third, but since then has like mobilize like an extensive number of followers and like just won like local elections, and one of the districts recently like overwhelmingly dominated every other party. And it's kind of been interesting to, you know, see that mobilization.
Well, that in case
So,
you
yeah.
might want be curious to look, because I don't look at that literature, what the academics are saying about Thailand and Thaksin Shinawatra, who was basically, you know, the person who kept winning the elections when they tried to rig the elections until they finally had to just go back to having coups. And he'd made his money in telecoms. You know, he'd served in the police, he had elite connections and family connections, but again, did not come up through the regular political process. So my educated guess is there are people who've probably tried to think, you know, what was happening there, and, you know, in a sense, the problem it proposed for the old guard, who were not willing to let go or risk alternating power. And, you know, basically 3 times, you know, they tried to rig the elections, and he won twice, and then his sister came in and was prime minister for a while until they finally forced her out. So yeah, some interesting stuff. Anyway, David probably has to kick us off and do something else.
Yeah, I've got to get to something else at 1:30 or 1:30 actually. So, but yeah, Brian, I appreciate all your comments as usual. They're always very, very thought-provoking stuff that's like just kind of, you know, forcing me to like scratch the surface even of like some more like difficult questions to wrestle with. So I appreciate it. I'm definitely, I think, gonna take a look a bit more into Thailand's political history, because like just the way you're talking about it, there might be some really interesting parallels to learn from there. So appreciate it.
Complicating thing you can also note down is there's a substrain of political violence, which also happens just with business, non-politically. So Ben Anderson, as in Imagine Communities, you might have run into, that's his famous book. But there's an article, what is it, Murder in Siam or whatever. I tried to search this morning. So it looks like it's just this, whatever, you'll find it. If you don't find it, send me a note if you're curious. And I can locate it for you.
Okay,
But
yeah, thank
talking
you.
about the context. Yeah, okay, great.
All right, well, thanks, Brian. I appreciate your time. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, and thank you, David, if you're still there.
Yeah, thanks, David. Bye.